Quorum is present. If everyone could grab their minutes. So if you could take a look at the minutes, and Vice Chair Bakeberg, if you've had a chance to review those, and after looking at those, if you'd like to move for approval.
Mr. Chair, I'd move that we approve the minutes from January 21st.
Okay. And any corrections or discussion? If not, Vice Chair Bakeberg moves the approval of the minutes. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. Minutes are approved. I'd like to welcome Chair Torkelson to the table, and he'll be partaking and just taking it all in. So, we're listening. Welcome. Today we'll be talking about the very large target that we'll be asking for in Ways and Means. I don't even think he got it.
Not wrong.
All right, so with that, members, we're going to go ahead, and we have Mr. Strom, Ms. Beckel, and Ms. Para. We're going to continue with where we left off after last week, and that is back to the overview and your presentation. So, Mr. Strom, if you'd like to take it from here.
Chair Krisha, members, thank you. As a quick reminder, on Tuesday, we went through how to read the state aid and levy tracking worksheets. We want to go through now just a little bit more background on the property tax for you. As we mentioned on Tuesday, about 65% of the school district revenue is from state aid and about 20% is from property tax. And changes tax committee makes to the tax base or growth in tax base, all those things can affect your local school levies for that 20% on average that comes from the levies. So we're gonna go through a variety of slides on tax base first, just to give you a little grounding in that and make it clear to you that any changes to the property tax system made by the tax committee will have ramifications for
And
this
Mr. Strom?
committee. And then after that, we'll get into the funding for schools itself and start looking at some school finance printouts.
And Mr. Strom, thank you for that. As you're doing that, just to tee us up, when you talk about the base, we just make sure for the committee and the new members, talk about what the base means, how if we were just not to pass anything, what that would look like going forward, just so we have clarification of that, and what our current expectations are with the law we passed. And I guess I have to speak into the mic.
And so does he.
And you as well, so, okay. Ready to go?
And Mr. Chair, Ms. Beckel will give you a quick overview of the base again, and then we'll get started here.
All right, Ms. Beckel, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so when we're talking about the base, Minnesota budgets on a base budgeting system. That means it doesn't go down to zero each time it sets a budget. It operates off of already set numbers. So what I discussed last Tuesday was the November base budget. So from the November forecast in 2024. So these were the numbers that were established from previous legislatures and are effectively the base upon which you will set your budget this session for fiscal years 26 and 27, and then you will set the base budget for fiscal years 28 and 29. I like to refer to the base as sort of the canvas upon which you will paint your budget each year. It's very nerdy, but I'm a fiscal person, so I get to be nerdy. So when you talk about targets, that means a number either above or below base. So above, you are adding to that canvas. Below, you are taking away. So you don't know what that target will be yet. That is a decision that is determined by your Ways and Means Chair in consultation with the Chief Fiscal Analyst and others. But it will be targets set for each committee. And usually those targets are made for fiscal years 26 and 27, the planning years, and fiscal years 28 and 29, the tails.
Very good. Thank you. Any questions on that? And of course, members, and the analogy of the canvas is very appropriate. Our job, of course, in committee is how we're going to put things on that canvas and how we're going to move them around and what paint we're given to by the Ways and Means or what paint is taken away from us. So, Mr. Strom?
Mr. Chair, thank you. So very quickly, we're gonna run through a little bit of definitional materials and some pie charts on the property tax front. As I mentioned, about 20-some% of the school funding in Minnesota for school districts comes from the property tax. Important to point out that property tax does not go to charter schools, but does go to school districts.
And
Property-
Mr. Snyder, if I could, let's just, what page, we're on 14, so if everyone has that in their packet.
Yep, so if we go to page 14.
Thank you.
So there's the tax committee in Minnesota, the tax committee in the House and the Senate have agreed on two different tax bases that schools use. They use a referendum market value tax. That's primarily for the voter-approved operating referendum. And then nearly all the other school district taxes, and as you remember from Ms. Beckel's spreadsheet, there's 30-some levy programs that school districts qualify for levies for. All of the rest of those, except for just a couple that are on referendum market value, are on adjusted net tax capacity. And that's the tax base that other local units of government, cities and counties use. So schools are a little unique in that they've got a lot of their taxes go out on referendum market value. But many of the levies are also on tax capacity, which is what other units of government use. The main difference, a tax capacity has class rates, referendum market value does not, and referendum market value excludes two classes of otherwise taxable property. Those are the ag lands outside of the house, garage, and 1 acre, and seasonal recreational property that's classified as residential seasonal rec property. I probably don't need to get into this too much in detail, but there on the next couple of slides, it's how these amounts are calculated. We start with the taxable market value. That's if the assessor were to look at all the value in the state and say, well, what would that sell for? That market value is the starting place. There's a small market value exclusion. And then tax capacity is arrived at by applying the statutory legal class rates against each type of property. And those class rates essentially vary. That's a legislative decision to make those vary. Finally, in the school world, we use something called the sales ratio to adjust for different assessment practices across the state. Here's a, heavy fingers today. Here's a list of those property tax class rates for that adjusted net tax capacity tax base. You can see that the first $500,000 of market value on a home has a class rate of 1%. Most ag property up to $2.1 million of value has a property class rate of 0.5%. The amounts over that at 1%. And then most commercial industrial property, except for that small exclusion of the first $150,000 of tax base, is at 2%. So one of the reasons there's two different tax bases is under adjusted net tax capacity, commercial industrial is paying essentially twice as much in terms of assessed value as residential homestead. There are a couple of different kinds of property tax relief that are important for committee members to think about. The primary one that works within the walls of this committee, but also with the tax committee, is the concept called equalization. And that's where the state will pay a portion of a program's cost based on the relative tax base of each community, in this case, school districts. For both formulas, for both referendum market value and adjusted net tax capacity, that measure for equalization is tax base per pupil unit. So you could have a lot of tax base and a lot of pupils and have a relatively low tax base per pupil because you have so many pupils. Or you could have very high tax base and relatively few pupils and have a very high tax base as well. We'll have printouts this session that we look at equalization programs, and you'll be able to see the relative differences in tax base amongst communities. We often refer to that as most and least wealthy in terms of tax base, but it's really not a measure of income at all. It's simply a measure of value per student. There's a second kind of property tax relief called tax credits, and that's where the state just directly pays for a portion of a cost where otherwise it would fall to the property tax. And the biggest of those is the school building bond agricultural credit. This program, currently about $100 million per year, buys down the tax rate or buys down the taxes for ag lands in greater Minnesota for the new schools that have been built. It's 70% essentially of the burden that otherwise would fall on the ag lands is paid for with a state tax credit. Remember that the house, garage, and 1 acre of the ag property is still going to be paying the same portion of tax as for the same value as a house in town. But for the ag lands, the credit, essentially, the school building bond ag credit, is the primary form of tax relief for school buildings that are being built in greater Minnesota. Oops. When we look at the property tax market value and taxes paid, you can see there's about $1 trillion of market value statewide. The $1 trillion of value, about half of that is in the residential homestead, the houses. About 15% is other residential, primarily apartments. Commercial industrial is about 12% of the market value tax base. And agricultural properties, about 19% of the tax base. The cabins, seasonal rec properties, about 4%. When we apply the class rates to that and the credits and things, then you can see the share of taxes paid. And you can see homeowners pay roughly about the same share, 50% of the total. I'm gonna skip on to the next chart. I don't think this taxes paid chart looks quite right. I think we had a formatting issue here. But you'll see the effect of class rates. I'll give you a corrected chart next time we meet in the packets. Apologies for that. When we look at the taxes paid by organization that collects them, you can see that school districts are currently the largest share out of the $13 billion of property taxes paid in taxes payable 2024. School districts were 30% of the total property taxes paid. Counties are 29%, and I believe in taxes payable in 2025, they'll be just a little bit above school districts in terms of total property tax. The city tax is about 27% of the total. Townships are only about 2.5% of the total taxes paid. There's a commercial industrial property tax that comes to the state. That amounts to about 6% of the state taxes paid. About 2% of property taxes wrapped up in tax increment finance or TIF payments. And then for special taxing jurisdictions, about 4% of the property tax proceeds go to the special districts. But the important point of this is that school districts rely on property taxes and are the single biggest recipient currently of property taxes in the state of Minnesota. Aren't any questions on the property tax base? We'll move on and talk a little bit about sort of the theoretical goals of a school financing system. Those goals tend to be stability, transparency, efficiency, and effectiveness. And often as school finance folks look at different systems across the country, they'll use these 4 measures to evaluate how well a school finance system is working. Oops. There's a couple of kinds of the term equity's been in use for a long time in the school area, not in relationship to the current usage of that word for DEI things, but for a measurement of how even are things across various districts and students. So equity for students is often divided into the categories of, is it equitable across students with different challenges? Is it equitable on a geographic basis? And is it equitable for students regardless of choice of program? And those are often the equity standards that school finance systems will be judged on. There's also equity for taxpayers, and this ties right back to our discussion of property taxes. And part of that issue is, how do we measure if a system's fair across taxpayers? Is it fair that the taxpayers in St. Michael Albertville pay a different amount than those in Edina, for example? And so there are equity measures we use to examine this. Essentially, the equity for taxpayers is the reason we've got equalization built into the school finance formulas. But again, it's a measure of how systems of school finance are judged, and those include things like the equity for taxpayers. There's an adequacy issue when folks look at school finance systems, and some of the adequacy measures that are looked at are, is it ensuring that all of the school districts, often called local education agencies, have the resources needed to provide an adequate basic education? Adequacy often looks at the basic formula and whether that's covering its proportional share. And then for the additional funding areas where there are excess costs, is there adequacy in the funding for those programs? So those are kind of the standards that school finance practitioners look at when they're examining school finance systems. In Minnesota, the legal context for school finance is primarily governed by two things. There's a charge, a very general charge in the Minnesota Constitution to fund schools. And then there's also a fair amount of state laws, legislation, and some rules regarding school finance. Relatively little of the context for school finance comes from federal laws outside of some specific programs like special education or Title I. Most of the context for school finance is going to be here at the state legislature. Minnesota's a bit unique in that the Department of Education has relatively few rulemaking powers and relatively few rules, but has a lot of guidance that districts are requested to follow. We can have a conversation at another time between guidance and rules, but essentially school districts, when we're looking at school finance in Minnesota, looking at the Constitution, the state laws, some federal laws, and then agency guidance. The constitutional provision, as you can see, is pretty vague in terms of what it says. This is in Article 13, Section 1 of the Constitution, and it declares that it's the duty of the legislature to establish a general and uniform system of public schools, and that system's got to be thorough and efficient. That's not really a cookbook for what you need to do, but that's the general guidance that the Constitution gives you all as you make your school finance decisions. There's a couple of court decisions that are probably helpful to you as you think about the Constitution and statutes for school finance in Minnesota. There was a big adequacy lawsuit settled in 1993 where the courts ruled on the Skeen decision. We can go into that at a different point in time if you like. And then the state of Minnesota is currently being sued under an action called the Cruz-Guzman lawsuit. And again, we can talk about that at a separate point in time as well.
And Mr. Strom, just quickly, do you remember when the Cruz-Guzman was first filed? How long has that been going on? Ms. Parra?
Mr. Chair and members, I believe 2014, 15, thereabouts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In terms of where, and this is all familiar to you, but in terms of where your school officials will find school laws and rules, the session laws often contain not just the funding for schools, but often riders on how particular programs work. The permanent laws of the state are collected in the statutes, and the code for school statutes is primarily between 120, chapters 120 through about 130. So when you're looking, when your school officials are looking for the state statutes on K-12 education, most of those are going to be in the 120s. Minnesota has an accounting system that it uses for schools, and there's sort of two main parts to that, or three perhaps. There's the UFARS accounting system, and since the 1970s, all school districts and charter schools in Minnesota are required to use the same accounting manual and account for their funds in the exact same way. So and it's a crosswalk system, it's a code that's 18 digits long for each transaction, but essentially it allows us to group school expenditures by program, by funding source, by fund balance, and a few other different ways as well. So the UFARS data is a very powerful data system and has given the state a very reliable set of information of school funding since the 1970s. In the late 1980s, the school accounting system was renamed the MARS system, and that collects student information. Each student in the public system is assigned a unique identification number, and all sorts of information about those students is collected and submitted to the state through the MARS system. That's our primary method for counting students. And then there's a third system for staff called the STARS system that's operated jointly between the Department of Education and the PELSB, the board responsible for overseeing teachers. So Minnesota has a relatively rich system of data with the accounting data in UFARS, the MARS data for students data, and the staff data through the STARS system.
Very well. Any questions? All right.
Okay, Mr. Chair, the fiscal context for schools, essentially they're getting their funding from three main sources, as we've said before. State aid payments from the state general fund, local property tax receipts, some of those are caused by the state telling the district to levy, others are voter approved, and federal funds. And most of the funding then that's collected is distributed to Minnesota School District on the basis of pupils, on the number of students served. Minnesota's, in many areas, has a fairly complex system of counting students. Some states rely simply on a single day's count. In Minnesota, we use a system that's an average daily membership count. That means school districts report their membership each day, and primarily the funding goes out on the number of students served. So if there are students resident to your districts that attend a charter school or attend another school district under open enrollment, those students will be counted in the school in which they're served, not in the school district where their house is or where they are resident. A few of the formulas are on a different basis, are counted on enrollment instead of on the average daily membership, but our primary method of funding in Minnesota is pupil-based, and that count of pupils is average daily membership. There's a couple of slides here that are probably a little more detailed than we need to go in today. Important just to think about average daily membership as being the full-time equivalent membership of the school. We start with that resident ADM, then adjust the ADM for the kids actually served at that school site. And then Minnesota's formulas weight the school kids by their grade. So students in kindergarten and grades 1 through 6 count as 1.0 pupil units, and secondary kids count at 1.2 pupil units. So for some of your schools with declining enrollment or changing enrollment, this weighting of students at the secondary levels can cause your district to look a little out of average just by basis of those pupil weights. Minnesota's families can choose to enroll in a number of options. They can enroll in the resident school district. Minnesota has an open enrollment statute that prohibits the district from preventing a student from enrolling in another district, but does not require the other school district to accept that student. A student may enroll in a charter school. A student may attend under our compulsory instruction laws a traditional non-public school, or a student may choose to be homeschooled. So those are the educational choices that a student faces in Minnesota.
And Mr. Strum, Representative Quam, do you have a question to this point, or do you just want to be on the list?
Mr. Chair, I did have a couple of clarification questions to this point.
Mr. Quam, go ahead. Representative Quam, go ahead.
What about PSEO? I don't see listed on there, and I'm not seeing the open enrollment to online only. I believe there are several in the state, and I think there's different financial interactions because of those two selections.
And Mr. Strum, PSEO and open enrollment.
Yes, Chair Krisha, Representative Quam, in terms of post-secondary enrollment options program, there's a couple of different models that can be used. If a student directly enrolls at a higher education institution, the state pays a portion of that student's funding directly to the higher education institution. A PSEO student may be a public school district student, maybe a homeschool student, or maybe a non-public student. The state pays essentially 88% of the formula allowance prorated for the time served directly to the PSEO program. When we dig into the information on PSEO, I'll provide you some handouts that show those payments by institution and show the amount of students that go from district to the PSEO program. There's a second type of PSEO where the funding stays local to the school district, and that's the college and the schools program. And in that case, the funding goes directly to the serving school district, and the school district either contracts with the higher education program to provide that program, or has their high school teachers trained by the higher education institution and working essentially with curriculum approved by them to provide the college and the school's program. And I'm sorry, I forgot what the second question was.
It was regarding open enrollment.
Oh.
Representative Quam, do you want to restate it? Oh, and online?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Representative Quam. In terms of the online programs, a student in Minnesota can attend a full-time online program that must be offered by a school district or a charter school. Often they'll contract with the provider of that program, or they can enroll in a supplemental online program where they'll take one or more courses through the online system, but not full-time. Those two arrangements are handled slightly differently financially, but essentially the money is following the student to the provider of that service, which is either a school district or a charter school that may then contract with a company behind the scenes to provide that programming. The number of online programs grew dramatically during the pandemic years. A number of schools now have closed their online program, but we're happy to provide you a list of those current online programs that exist in Minnesota, and we can get into the details of how those work, the approval process for those. Again, those like PSEO and open enrollment, the student is the primary driver of the decision to take that course, but essentially needs to get accepted into the program to do so. But essentially, the school district can't tell the student that you're not allowed to enroll in an online course.
Representative Quam, follow-up? I'm good. You're good? Okay. Mr. Strong, back to you.
Chair Kresha, I thought it'd be helpful to look at enrollment trends over time. Time started about when I did, I guess, for purposes of this chart, but often our data gets very bad prior to about 1960. But if you look at this chart, the top line there is the charter school and district enrollment over time. And you can see that baby boom had a huge impact on Minnesota from about 1960 to 1972. Enrollment went up by almost a third and then dropped pretty substantially as the baby boom declined. And then starting in the mid-'80s, picked up again. And in Minnesota, this was for two reasons. The first of those were the baby boomers were having children, shocking that. And so there was an increase there that sort of mimics the generation before it. But Minnesota also had a fair amount of in-migration of students from other countries and other states as well. And so you can see from 1985 or thereabouts up until about 2000 that the enrollment in Minnesota was growing statewide. And then from 2000 to 2020 or thereabouts, the dipped a little and then came back up at the end of the 20 teens. And then our projections are the statewide projections through 2029 that enrollment for public schools will be falling by a relatively small amount. But since you pay on a per pupil level per student, that's something for this committee to keep in mind. The red line is the traditional non-public schools. You can see that they reached almost 175,000 students in about 1966 before their enrollment started declining. And you can see that it's been in slow decline up until about 2020. And since that time, the enrollment in traditional non-public schools has grown fairly substantially. For homeschool students weren't counted prior to 1985. And as a result, our data series starts then. There were certainly homeschool students prior to 1985. You can see that the growth there has been pretty substantial as well. Some of that in the early years may have been the increased information about the reporting requirements. But you can see from this chart that we're at about 29,000 homeschoolers in Minnesota. So, Mr. Chair, those are the three main groups of enrollment for Minnesota students.
And Mr. Strong, and maybe this Ms. Perry, just how good is your memory? When was the great charter school legislation and compromise? What year was that?
Mr. Chair, we'll go one slide further.
Very good.
And in 1991, the legislature passed the charter school law, and the first year that students were enrolled was fiscal year 93, which was the 92-93 school year. And you can see that the number of charter school students started basically at zero and grew at a very high rate for their first 20 years or so of existence. That growth rate has slowed down a fair amount. And you can see starting in, the state is still predicting charter school enrollment to continue to grow through 2029. But that rate of growth has slowed down since about 2020. Currently, about 72,000 charter school students are estimated for the current school year in Minnesota. So not quite 10%, between 8 and 10% of the state's public school students are enrolled in charter schools.
Very good, and thanks for forecasting my question. Representative Quam, did you have another question on this topic?
Yes, Mr. Chair, if I may, looking at the public school enrollment and the changes, it may be interesting to members if we plotted consolidation of districts when those occurrences happened, and also districts in statutory operating debt, because I think there are some trends and correlations with the enrollment trends which triggered those activities, and that might help us to understand as we have a decrease, what we might have to keep in mind.
Mr. Strom?
Mr. Chair, Representative Quam, yes, there have been about in the late 1980s was the start of the last major round of school consolidations, and about 150 school districts consolidated over the next 20 years. In large part, the enrollment statewide washes out the increases in some areas like the exurban and second and third ring metro areas, and some of the declines in the rural areas. Those declines were much sharper in greater Minnesota during the 80s and 90s, and the enrollment's been relatively similar by region, and we can show you enrollment changes for the last 20 years by region if that's helpful to you. But part of the issue is in some regions, for example, your portion of the state, there's a number of districts including the one you were the board chair of that have been growing a lot, but don't go too much further out from Olmsted County, and you'll see some relatively sharp declines in enrollment there. The state hasn't had many consolidations over the last 10 years, just a handful. They're expecting perhaps one consolidation this year, but I'm guessing 3 or 4 years from now, the state's going to be in the midst of another significant round of consolidations.
Representative Quam, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for confirming my suspicions that some of the data we're looking at would be very useful for us to have some regional data to be able to understand one size doesn't fit all when we do some of the determinations. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Strom?
Mr. Chair, Representative Quam, and we will look at a couple of regional slides here in just a minute as well. I wanted to also point out that there's been shifts in the demographics of Minnesota's school children, and the next chart that you'll see puts several lines there for you to see. You can see the change in students eligible for free and reduced price meals under the federal rules on the yellow line on the top of the graph here. You can see the blue line, which is the students of color and American Indian students, and how that's changed over time since the turn of the millennium. The relatively shallower increase in the number, but continual increase in the percentage of students in Minnesota that are eligible for special education revenue, and then the change in the number, the bottom line on that chart is the change in the number of English learner students in Minnesota. So there have been considerable changes in the underlying population in Minnesota. When we do look by regions, one of the ways that we'll divide school districts.
Mr. Strom? I'm sorry. Representative Mueller?
Oh, pardon me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just looking at the graph and looking at, it said for the free and reduced lunch, that yellow line there, how it had that huge sharp, is that A, during the pandemic, number one, and B, that was when we couldn't, or we weren't able to collect those forms, continuing to not collect some of those forms because of universal school lunches. Just wanted to know, because I mean, I can't imagine, we've had such a sharp drop off on some of these things.
Mr. Chair, Representative Mueller, yes, that drop was primarily related to the pandemic, and as I hope to get the fall of '24 count data soon, and I guess I don't know why I don't have '23 on this chart, but I'll redo that chart with '23, and hopefully in the next week or two, we'll have the fall of '24 count as well. That number probably will be back up at about 33 or 34%, I would guess, of the totals, and for identification purposes for compensatory revenue, as you mentioned, starting with the fall of 2024 count, the numbers that will be provided, I believe, will just be the direct certification numbers and not
Okay.
the paper applications, which in some districts can be up to 15% of the total. Those paper applications are sometimes referred to as application for educational benefits. But there was a cresting basically at about 2012 and a steady decrease from there, a sharp decrease with the pandemic years. And I would expect as we go out into the future that the numbers will generally reflect the overall economy, but probably be in that closer to 35% range going forward.
Representative Mueller, follow up?
Thank you.
Representative Bennett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mr. Strahm, for this. Question, the free and reduced lunch line again. Does any of this change according to the criteria changes that the legislature has made on, the percentage of poverty for qualifying for free and reduced lunch? Would that change this data at all, or does it still, is this just purely the number of students? Am I getting at the right question? I don't know, but.
Mr. Chair, Representative Bennett, yes, you're asking the right question, and those standards will be the same. That will be the number based on the federal poverty guidelines. The free lunch standard is 130% of the federal poverty guideline, and that's that guideline amount varies by family size. The more members in the family, the higher that federal poverty guideline for that family. And then the reduced price meal, federal reduced price meal is at 185%. So the state hasn't altered those criteria at all. Those two stay the same, but the two big changes for the meals program, the state put in place the School Meals for All program 2 years ago, and then for the compensatory revenue program, the two big changes there, the identification method in the fall of '22 added, there's a form of identification called direct certification, where the state matches data from human services programs, and at that time, prior to 2022, SNAP was the largest EHS program that the matching was done on. In 2022, that count was the first count to include matching on medical assistance as well. And so when we look at the specifics of programs like compensatory revenue, the printouts will show a dramatic increase between the count of 22 and 21 and 22 because of the inclusion of the direct certification of MA families. The paper application forms are last fall was the last year that those will go into count under current laws. So for fiscal '26, the coming school year, the expectation in law currently is that just the direct certification numbers will be used. And the paper application amounts differed substantially among school districts, and it's not a pattern that I can identify why necessarily. There can be two districts right next to each other serving the same kinds of populations where one has a much higher identification through the paper forms than another. And it's not entirely clear to me why that's the case. So when we get the updated forecast data and the updated fall enrollment for 2024, we'll be able to compare for each school district how the loss of the paper applications has affected them compared to the prior years where it's combined paper and direct certification.
Thank you.
Representative Bennett, follow?
Good.
Mr. Chair, I think we should just pause on this for 1 second. Under categories of things we'll be talking about for $400, this is one that will be in front of us, compensatory. So I just want to make sure everyone in the committee understands what we just walked through, what Mr. Strom just walked you through, which is the direct certification versus the paper. If you have further slides, I can wait for you, but I just want to make sure we have clarification with this committee, because this will be a topic that we will have to address. Everybody understand, and if you don't, now is a good time, what the paper certification versus the direct certification, how that applies to what was free and reduced, but now also directly applies to compensatory. Questions? And you're welcome to take those offline as well. Representative Bakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Strom. And the chair hit the nail on the head. This is a very huge piece that we're hearing from our school districts. So, and whoever wants to answer this is totally fine, but, so, in '26, districts will no longer be able to use direct certification and the paper pencil form. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chair, Representative Bakeberg, yes, that's accurate, that the paper applications are not going to be included, under current law, are not included in the count for the 25-26 school year, fiscal year '26.
Representative Bakeford, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Strom. Can you just I remember us having that conversation, but can you just refresh my memory and just get everyone else up to speed on why we're moving away from the paper pencil forms and only using direct certification?
Mr. Strom.
Chair Kresha, Representative Bakeberg, these things are sometimes hard for me to place back together exactly why the change happened. I think it's important in the context to think of two major things. The inclusion of medical assistants added several hundred million dollars per year to compensatory revenue and changed the landscape fairly dramatically. So on the one hand, the state had the change because of inclusion of MA into direct certification. And the second change was the Universal School Meals Program. And as part of that Universal School Meals Program, on some folks' part, there was a hope that the paper forms could be done away with entirely. And a combination of these factors, I think, got all rolled together in the 2023 conference committee. And without ascribing motives to anyone, I think the decision was reached that there was a statewide grandfather in place for '26 and '27, and thereafter to ensure that compensatory didn't fall below a certain level. But the decision was made to keep the reporting essentially on the basis of direct certification. I'm not sure I can speak to why that happened, but those were the forces in motion that were surrounding that decision when the decision was made.
Representative Bakeford, follow up.
Yes. Are there other, thank you, Mr. Chair, thank you, Mr. Strom. Are there other factors, or are there other things that school districts use that paper pencil form for, other benefits, other items that you're aware of that help inform the school district to better serve their community?
Mr. Strom.
Mr. Chair, Representative Bakeberg, yes, the primary one I'm aware of is for the use of fee waivers, and often those are fee waivers for participation in after-school events like sports events. School districts often use the free and reduced lunch eligibility as the determination whether a student should pay a reduced amount to participate in a sport. That's the primary place that I'm aware of that's used. There is an interaction between the federal Title I program and the free and reduced lunch under the federal standards counts, but that I am not aware that there's a direct link there. And so in terms of the ones I can speak to, essentially the use for extracurricular activities is the major one that I'm aware of.
Representative Bakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Strom. And I don't want to get too far out over my skis and maybe outside of your realm of expertise, which is vast and wide, I might add. But do you know, does the direct certification or the paper pencil application forms, does that play into classifications for extracurricular activities for the class level that a given team may compete at?
Mr. Strong?
Mr. Chair, Representative Bakeberg, yes, it's my understanding, and the high school league could speak to this, but it's my understanding that the high school league weights teams on the basis of the number of federally free and reduced lunch eligible students in each district. So there could be some switching among sports classes. Essentially, a larger school with more children eligible for free or reduced price meals can play in a lower class than if none of the students were eligible. I don't know how often the high school league updates that measure. And I don't know when, if at all, direct certification would play in that. But I expect that, and those decisions as to class are high school league made, but probably best for the high school league to tell us about this. I'm a little out of my area here.
Representative Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Strom. This, those are, and you hit the nail on the head, what I've heard from schools and the concerns with this compensatory piece. So, I see a couple of our school groups are in the room, so would really invite feedback on how to best address this compensatory issue, because as the chair well said, this is a pretty significant issue that is not only dollars and cents, but, if we start changing classifications of where teams are competing in sports, I don't know if you guys have gone to youth sports, but parents get pretty passionate about their kids' youth sports. So, yeah, thank you for just really breaking it down in simple terms for me.
And just quickly, so thank you, Representative Bakeberg, for all that. And I do want to thank everyone that's here, by the way, in the audience and all the groups. These conversations are super important, and just really appreciate having here. And just to let you know, Representative Baker, you touched on a couple things. I think we actually have a solution to the compensatory problem. And Representative Reimer and I are on the Commerce Committee, and we should have sports betting passed before the hockey tournament, and therefore that online will fuel this. Thank you for indulging me on that one. What I do, as we talk about this, and this is one of the top issues that's out there, and I would encourage the members here, as you know, a week from Thursday, we'll be inviting you to bring local school district leaders in, and maybe prep them a little bit, and let's talk about the compensatory and try to get to their understanding as well of, here we have school funding that has gone up, but compensatory is declining, and trying to understand how that's affecting each school and what we need to talk about here. As Representative Bakeberg and Mr. Strom's exchange noted, this is very important to the schools, and it's also very complicated, and there's a big uncertainty of why it's happening the way it is. And we're going to need to try to find some answers to that. So I would invite you to talk to your school officials about that and let them weigh on what they're seeing, because that's ultimately what we're gonna need to dig into, is why it's happening in their districts. So, Mr. Strom, if you'd like to continue on.
Mr. Chair, thank you. And we will spend, when we get to the printouts, we'll spend some time on the compensatory revenue column there. And it'll be an example of an area where I can provide the committee further information if they'd like on that topic. Back to the issue of enrollment, one of the primary things for this committee to keep in mind is that Minnesota's a little unique, both in the number of school districts and charter schools it has, and the geographic distribution of those districts, as well as the size of the districts. And if we look by economic development region, which really is pretty well aligns with the service cooperative region, you can see that about 53% of the students in Minnesota are in the 7-county metro area. And then you can go around the pie and see the amounts of students in each of the other regions of the state. And so there are 48 school districts in the metro area, and the remaining 330 school districts are in greater Minnesota. And so you can see on this chart that the number of students is the number of those regions of the state have fairly small number of students, and that's important to keep in mind when we think about the way formulas are designed. Another way to group school districts is to divide the school districts into size on a quintile basis. And you can see that in Minnesota school districts, if you divide them into 5 equal chunks based on districts, the 66 smallest districts in the state serve about 2% of the kids. About 17,000 kids are in those 66 smallest districts. The next 66 smallest districts serve about twice that many children. And then the middle 66 school districts serve about 60,000 kids. And the second largest number of kids then is served in the 60, the fourth quintile essentially. And then if you look at that last quintile on the chart, you can see that the 65 largest districts in the state are serving 543,000 students. So another point to keep in mind when thinking about our overall school finance system in Minnesota, not just geographically are the districts different, but they are very different on the basis of size as well.
Thank you, Mr. Strong, for making quintile the word of the day. We are in the second quintile of the meeting. You may continue.
As I mentioned, we're gonna get to the printouts pretty quick here, and I hope we'll get.
How are we doing for time?
I think we're doing pretty good.
Very
so,
good.
But please feel free to speed me up if I'm dragging a little bit here. As I mentioned previously, most of the funding formula is, for Minnesota schools is pupil-based. There are some funding formulas, however, that are cost-based, and the biggest of those is special education, and we'll have a printout in the packet on special education as well as general education. And there are a few other smaller programs like the Career and Technical Education Program that are cost-based programs. But those are the two primary methods in Minnesota of funding. One of those is the pupil-based, and the second is the cost-based programs like partial reimbursement programs like special education. When we look at Minnesota's school funding system, there's more than 40 different aid and levy programs and many small programs as well. Recall from Ms. Beckles' aid and levy tracking sheets how many lines there were on those. But if you look at the major sources of revenue for school district, they're gonna be in one of 4 categories. They're gonna be general education revenue, special education revenue, the amount the voters have approved in your districts for operating revenue, and the amounts that have been approved by the voters in your district for building projects. And if we break down the average district, and none of your districts are average, but if we broke it down on a average district basis of the components of the school finance system for this current year, we're expecting the school districts to bring in just under $19 billion in total. Not quite half of that is through the general education program. About 5% are for the operating referendums approved by the voters. Special education's about 13.5% of the total. Federal funds on the upper left here you can see is almost 8% of the total for this year. That's probably gonna be falling closer to 6% for fiscal year 26. And then you can see the facilities revenue, which is primarily the building bonds that the voters in your districts have approved. For an average district would be about 10% of the district's total funding. So just to give you some sense of the components of the funding system that we're gonna look at. But what we'll turn to now is a printout for that 44% on the right called general education revenue. And that's the primary chunk of undesignated money that your districts have to spend on operating purposes. So if you'll pull out a printout in front of you, there's a printout on the on general education revenue that's done on the legal size paper, and I'll pop this up on the screen here in a second. And this printout is designed to show you the general education revenue for the current school year. And give me just one moment.
Mr. Strong, this is the legal size. It says November 2024 on the top. General education revenue?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you for helping identify that. So it's legal size to landscape in your packets, and it shows each of the components of general education revenue. And excuse me for not having this loaded. Let's see here.
This is the legal size.
Turn this off for 2 seconds.
This one right here.
Okay, good.
Oh, perfect, yeah. Good. Thank you, Ms. Beck.
Thank you. I appreciate your help. That too.
Does everyone have it? Good. Good.
Fantastic. Bailed out like always by Ms. Beckles, so this should pop up on your screen here for you. And there's, in addition to learning a little about the components of general education, what I really want to focus on for you all is how to read a printout. And so this general education printout gives us a good chance of how to look through this and how to read. Oh, whoops, this is the inflation, just, thank you. No, 2 secs here and we'll get the other one up. But you're gonna find a lot of commonalities in how we read these printouts. And the goal is just to make you very comfortable with them and understand what you're looking at. And as a starting place, let me tell you a little about how printouts are organized. Usually there'll be a strata at the top of the page that groups districts into the 8 different groups you see there. Minneapolis, St. Paul, then the inner ring suburbs, the outer ring suburbs, and then greater Minnesota's districts divided by size. And so those strata are a way for us to think about differing districts that may share certain kinds of characteristics. Then a printout usually lists the school district's number and name. And for many reasons, I tend to list these in ascending district order. That seems silly because a lot of you, it'd be easier for you to find your districts if you could just look alphabetically. And of course, we can sort them however you'd like. But the reason why they're generally grouped by ascending district number order is that the district numbers generally speaking, depend on the county that the school district is in. So for example, the 27th county is Hennepin County, and you're gonna find all the Hennepin County districts starting in the 270s. Dakota County's the 19th county, so all of the Dakota County districts will have a district number starting 190. So for those of you that wanna see multiple of your districts at the same time in district orders can allow you to see some of your districts that are next to each other by county order. But again, we're happy to sort printouts in any way, shape, or form that you all like. Almost always on printouts will show amounts on a per pupil basis, a per pupil unit basis. And the reason for this is as we start measuring changes, if you know that Anoka's getting $340 million and your district's getting $250, it may not make any sense unless you have a common metric. And so one of the reasons we show amounts on a per pupil unit basis is it allows us to show whether a district per kid is the same as another district. So in that first column of data, you can see for the 24-25 school year, the state expects there to be 931,000 pupil units in school districts and charter schools. And as you look up and down that list, you can see District 11, the Anoka School District's the largest in the state with 41,595 students. And maybe we'll just follow Anoka all the way across on this printout. So the basis for funding is that measure of adjusted pupil units. That's where the students are weighted at the K-6 level at 1.0 and the secondary kids are counted at 1.2. For our funding formula, if you look at the top very right-hand corner, you can see there's $10,697 is the average amount per pupil unit for funding. And the largest share of that, about 3/4 of that, comes through the basic formula allowance. And the basic formula allowance is set in statute by the legislature. That's the amount that the legislature puts on that line, and that's the one number that's gonna be the same for all the school districts in the state. So as you look up and down the list in that first column there, basic pupil revenue, that 3/4 of general ed revenue at $7,281 is the same whether you're in South St. Paul, Centennial, Anoka, Aiken. Every district gets the same amount there.
And
Then
Mr.
as we
Strom,
work-
1 second. Does everyone have one of these in their packet? Okay, very helpful. Mr. Strom?
Mr. Chair, thank you. Yes, it helps to keep those rows together. The next column is something called extended time revenue. This is the revenue a school district gets for its extended day and time, including its summer school programming. That varies by usage, and you can see the average at the top, $50 per pupil. And as if you look up and down the list, you can see that those districts that offer more of that programming receive a higher amount of extended time funding. One other Small point to mention on this, a number of districts in greater Minnesota provide their programming with a single district being the host. And so you may see a large number for a rural district that's actually the host for 5 or 6 neighboring districts as well. Then we come to compensatory revenue, and as we just finished discussing, that's $939 dollars per pupil on average. That's the single largest component of general education revenue after the basic per pupil amounts. And you can look up and down the list there. You can see that Anoka Hennepin's a little under the state average at $848 per pupil, and then the next 4 districts above it are all quite a bit above the state average. The compensatory revenue is a concentration formula, and it's based on the number of students in the school district that qualify for free and reduced price meals. And this again is where, this is 25 here, we don't have 26 in front of us yet, and we don't have the final data for 26 yet. But you can see that as your compensatory kid count goes up, your concentration increases and your compensatory revenue increases as well. So you can look up and down the list there and see the relative amounts of compensatory revenue. One other point to make on compensatory revenue, it's not based on the current year's adjusted average daily membership, but rather on the previous year's enrollment. So one way to think about that is there's always a year's lag in compensatory revenue, and sometimes that'll make the numbers seem a little large or a little small for a district if their pupil units are changing substantially between those 2 years. The next component of general education revenue is the English learner formula. There's a couple of parts to that formula. You can see there that the average is $122 per pupil unit that goes out. And you can look up and down the list. You can see that Anoka's a little below average there, whereas Columbia Heights, a neighboring district, is quite a bit above the state average because of the number of English learner pupils in the district. Greater Minnesota shows the same pattern as the metro area. There are some communities in greater Minnesota with a very large number of English learner students, and that category is going to be quite a bit above average for those districts. And there may be other districts in greater Minnesota with very small English learner populations, and their revenue will reflect that as well. Next to that is something called small schools revenue. Again, a very small amount of funding. And one little rule of thumb that's a little bit off, but sometimes helpful for you all, is as you're computing the amounts per pupil to the statewide total, if you look at that statewide total pupil units, that's just a little under 1 million pupils. So you can always think about these programs as each dollar per pupil being about $1 million statewide. So in terms of the basic formula at $7,281, you can think about that being about $7.3 billion statewide. The compensatory about $900 million statewide. The small schools program, which helps school districts with less than 960 kids, is only about 17 million statewide, but you can see it applies to a relatively small number of districts, and the amounts per pupil are quite large in those districts. Then next to that column is the operating sparsity formula. That formula helps geographically isolated small school districts, and you can look up and down the revenue amounts there. You can see the average is $34 per pupil. Most districts get 0, but some districts get in excess of $3,000 per pupil in sparsity revenue. And the idea behind that formula is that if a small rural district is geographically isolated, it may not make sense for that district to consolidate with a neighboring district. And so the state has this formula that provides additional sparsity revenue for those small school districts. There's a second category of sparsity revenue called transportation sparsity. In the mid-1990s, the state did away with the categorical funding for transportation and instead added a measure that's based essentially on the density of each school district. You can see the average district gets about $100 per pupil, but as you look up and down the list, again, you'll see wide variation in the transportation sparsity column, and that's money that's used by the districts for busing. Districts can provide their busing either through a contract arrangement or through their own employees. Many districts do a combination of the both. Operating capital revenue has about 20-some uses in statute. It's primarily for equipment and small facility needs. You can see there's very little variation there, about $229 per pupil on average. There's an age index on the age of facilities, and that's what causes that revenue to vary. A formula created in the mid-1990s called the equity formula provides $114 per pupil on average. And you can look up and down the list there and see how that varies by district. One of the smallest categories of revenue is gifted and talented revenue. This formula hasn't changed in many years. Each district's given $13 per pupil in gifted and talented revenue. Transition revenue is a polite word for a hold harmless. You can see on average, there's $30 per pupil for districts for this hold harmless, and you can look up and down the list and see the winners and losers with that hold harmless, which reflects some changes to the school finance system that happened in the mid-1990s. There's a series of options adjustments that we don't need to get into in much detail now, but school districts transfer money back and forth for various purposes. And there's 3 different options adjustments. There's only a small amount on average, but much of that adjustment it varies by individual district. The fifth to last category is the voter-approved operating referendum. The average is just under $1,000 per pupil. But again, you can see very wide variation on districts. The Anoka School District's about state average at $1,100 per pupil, but quite a bit below the suburban average, the metro average, and quite a bit above the greater Minnesota average as well. Minnesota has an element of the school finance system called declining pupil enrollment. The idea behind this formula element is to soften the loss of pupil units to give districts a little longer to adjust as their pupil count declines. Essentially, what the state formula does is provide about 1 unit of funding for every 4 pupil units that leave the district for 1 year. So if your district had 1,000 kids last year and 992 kids this year, you'd get essentially 2 kids worth of funding in that declining pupil unit category for 1 year. There's been some changes to the teacher pension system over the last several years. For about 20 years, there's been an adjustment in the formula so that the employer share of those changes is paid for as part of general education revenue. And you can see there the average district gets about $90 per pupil of additional general education money because of the higher employer contribution rates that the legislature has placed on the teacher retirement fund. Finally, there's a category of revenue called local optional revenue, where a district at board approval can choose to have an equalized aid and levy of $724 per pupil. This is one of these formulas. You can look at the charter school line there and see this is one of these formulas, does not apply to the charter schools. But the average school district, almost all the school districts in the state, there's just a handful that are less than the full $724 per pupil. So then you can add these columns all up on the sheet, and you'll see that the average district gets $10,697 per pupil. And you can look at how your district, the Anoka district, which we're following across, is just a little below the state average. Several of the districts right above it are above the state average, and you can look up and down the list and see where those districts are. And you can look at the top at the strata and look at the various types of school districts in the state by those strata and see how the revenue, general education revenue varies. So, Mr. Chair, this is a pretty in-depth document in front of you, but it's kind of one of your major tools to analyze how school funding is working for your districts. And then as changes are proposed to the school funding system, we'll use a similar printout to this so that members can see whether that change is benefiting their district or not and by how much.
And thank you, Mr. Strom. I have a couple questions on the list here. Just by way of roadmap and time, how much do you have left to cover for today?
Well, Mr. Chair, I can finish at any time. There's 2 things that I thought would be helpful for the committee. There's a special education printout that we won't spend as much time on. And then there's because of the inflation added to the school funding formula, there's a way that we're intending to show inflation on the printouts this year that may be a bit confusing. And it may make sense to spend a bit of time on that printout as well, just so members can see how inflation built into the formula allowance affects the school funding bottom line.
Very good. And so just, so the committee has, so we know the roadmap. So you've got special ed, and you're gonna, and then you want to cover the inflation piece. So two things left to cover. I have two questions. I'd like to get us done at about 2:40. And just to let the audience know, thank you for coming, and as a reward, if you'd like, I'll save 5 minutes if any of you wants to come up and just do a quick introduction of who you are. So just give them a chance. Warm fuzzy. Representative Bakebird.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for just a thorough walkthrough. Just a couple of questions. So if I look at declining enrollment, so if I'm understanding this right, we're spending about approximately $18 million on a declining enrollment. And that, the intent of that is to, for at least a year, allow districts to absorb enrollment leaving. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Representative Bakebird.
Mr.
Yes,
Strong.
that applies for 1 year. So if the district dropped from 1,000 to 992 kids, for those 8 kids that were lost, you'd count 2 of those essentially for 1 year only. And then the next year, if there were no further declines, if you stayed at 992 kids in your district, there'd be 0 declining pupil unit revenue for you. So it's a 1 year measure, last year to the current year, funded on the decline in roughly 25, it's a little more than 25%, but basically for every 4 kids you lose, you're getting the general ed funding for one of those kids.
Follow up, Mr. Representative Bakebird.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Strom. So that explanation makes sense. So, and then just kind of looking holistically at this, if we put 1%, 2%, 3% on the formula, does that hit every one of these buckets, that every one of these categories are increased by that 1%?
And Mr. Strong, before you answer that, which is, I'd also like us to go to the inflation piece before we do the special ed. And the reason I'm asking this now is, will that question tie into that conversation? If so, I'd ask that we move that question to that.
Mr. Chair, let me provide a very brief answer, and then we will go to the inflation-adjusted
Very good.
form after that. So on your spreadsheets, just a few of the categories are linked to the increase in the basic formula allowance, and those are compensatory revenue, operating sparsity, transportation sparsity, and the referendum inflation for districts that have approved that keys off the same measure of inflation, but that the voters, when they approve our operating referendum, can approve it with or without an inflation adjustment. But those 3 columns, compensatory, operating sparsity, and transportation sparsity, are the 3 on the printout that are linked to inflation.
Thank you. All right, Representative Dipple.
Thank you,
Pal,
Chair.
excuse me.
That's all right. Thank you,
Janelle
Chair.
kicks me every time I get that wrong, so the bruises are growing.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair Creasy, and appreciate the information, Mr. Strom. I had a question about the equity per pupil, and if you could go into greater detail of what that category covers. That is, I think, 8th out of all the categories here and 6th out of the 15 subcategories. It's a significant amount of money, and just wondered if you could define that further.
Mr. Strong.
Mr. Chair, Representative DePel, one of the balances the legislature faces is how to deal with the voter-approved operating referendum amounts. Some districts, whether it's voters that are more willing to vote for a referendum or a higher tax base, have considerably larger amounts of referendum than other districts. And one of the ways that the legislature chose to respond to that was with the equity formula. And that particular formula essentially measures how low our school district's referendum is compared to the highest referendum districts, basically. So in general, the equity revenue is designed for low referendum districts. They get a larger amount of equity revenue. So it's basically a sliding scale, but there's a couple of twists in it. There's a portion of it that school districts of the first class aren't eligible for. So if you look up at Minneapolis, for example, that's why their number will be so low. And then because it keys off that inflation level, that referendum level, when you get above the 95th percentile, you're also excluded. So some of the districts with very high referendum will be excluded entirely from the majority of the equity revenue. But it's basically an inverse relationship to the amount of voter-approved referendum. Our school finance guides that Ms. Beckel and I prepare have some additional detail about that for you. And we can go into greater detail about why that's crafted the way it is. But some of these elements of the school finance formula are perhaps lose their meaning a bit over time. And if one were to start from zero, one might choose a different equity measure. But this essentially was a measure of referendum and saying, well, if you've got a high referendum, you should get an additional amount. And basically, there was also another part of it that said, but if you haven't passed even $1 of referendum initially, then there was a lower amount. So it sort of was trying to force districts to pass at least a little bit of referendum and then provide more of this category of revenue for those with smaller amounts of voter-approved referendum. I don't think that if one were to take this formula today, that one would say, oh, that's the best way to handle that. But a lot of these parts of the school finance formula that were designed 25, 30 years ago are hard to undo in some ways, because undoing them makes winners and losers. And one might decide there's a much better measure of equity revenue than simply looking at that referendum difference among school districts. I'm probably saying a little too much, but I guess at times I feel like I can be a bit blunt about these things. But the money, the money is real money, and the rationale behind it, I think, made sense that referendum was a disequalizing resource. The formula should adjust for those that couldn't pass as much referendum as other districts.
And Mr. Strong, before I go back to follow up, are the rankings regional or statewide?
Mr. Chair, on the equity revenue, the state is broken into two regions, and there's
Winners and losers?
There's a 95%. Well, the idea behind it was the 95% band that's been established would better serve the greater Minnesota districts if there were two equity regions. But then an equity adjustment got added that added an additional 25% for the metro area. So again, I presume that I can cover my ears and cover my eyes and just say that I don't think anyone would design a formula like this today.
Fair point. Representative DePel, follow up?
No follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your bluntness, Mr. Strom. I like straight answers, and I appreciate that.
Representative Hudson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The last time I felt like this was when I was back in school. Enrolled in an AP math class that I was not ready for.
We have AI now, Representative Hudson.
So I've got a lot of questions, but we don't have enough time to cover all of them. So I just want to try to zero in on trying to understand conceptually why these numbers are so different from one another. So for example, if you look at the English learner category, and I'm going to pick on my new friend, Representative Rapinski from Winona, because that's the school district that I'm comparing my own to. They appear to be doing pretty well there in Winona in this and other categories. So his school district gets more than 3 times the amount per pupil in this category of English learner than my school district does. And what I'm wondering is that because, does that correlate with the number of students that require English learner services? And if so, why would that translate to an adjustment in the per pupil funding, if that makes any sense? I don't even know how to phrase the question.
Mr. Strom?
Representative Hudson. Yes, the English learner revenue keys off of the number of English learners in each school district. The greater that number, the greater the English learner revenue. We can provide you a list that shows that English learner revenue by district as well as the counts by district. There's a concentration formula as well on a smaller amount of the money, but essentially, the way the formula works is if you have at least one English learner student in the district, you count at 20, and then as you get above 20, you count each additional student. So that's the starting place for the formula, and then there's a basic formula and a concentration formula. The concentration formula is about a third of that size, but really it just goes up as the number of English learners in the district increases. The requirement for the English learner students is that they be tested on the English learner tests that the state asks the districts to use. And once the students' English skills are proficient on that test, the student no longer counts for English learner revenue. And in addition, no student counts for more than 7 years of English learner revenue. But we're happy to provide a detail of that particular formula as well as the counts by district. In terms of your more general question, I think it's the million-dollar question with school finance systems. Would it make more sense to combine any or all of these categories on the average line at the top and simply provide them in the basic revenue? Or is there a reason for an individual categorical component level of funding? And the legislature has essentially said with each of these categories that those are important categories to fund separately from the basic per pupil. But that's part of the decision you'll make as a committee is, are these the right amounts? Should these categories still exist? But on the English learner, it's test in, test out, no more than 7 years, but basically it's the count of English learners in the district that's driving the funding.
Representative Hudson, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would it be inappropriate for me to direct a question at another member?
No, go ahead, Representative Hudson.
Representative Bakeberg. As an administrator, it occurs to me, and again, taking a fresh look at this, that it's very hard to discern both the intentions, the incentives that these funding mechanisms create for folks in a position like yours and school boards. Could you talk a little bit about how the way this is being done currently impacts your ability to administrate a school?
Representative Bakeberg.
Do you have another hour?
Well, that's a loaded question, Representative Hudson, but I think, so going back 20 years ago when I was getting my principal license, there was a joke in the school finance class that there are really only a couple people in Minnesota that truly understand this. And I think, Mr. Strom's name may have been talked about in that class. But the joke was that we won't allow those two people to get on an airplane. And the professor of the class was, I believe, a superintendent. And he said, I'm joking, but I'm also serious. Because there's so many complications to this formula. One of my previous districts, we benefited greatly from an increase in transportation sparsity because we were a more rural district. And then, when I was in St. Michael Albertville, when different buckets were addressed, it created winners and losers. So I think it's, you talk about the English language learner. I think there's some validity to having some funding specified, but, and as I was gonna ask Mr. Strom this offline, but if that funding is lagging, it's not helping me address the current need I have right in front of me of a student who just showed up and who is new to country, doesn't speak the language, and our desire as a school is just to serve the kid. We don't care about anything else. We just wanna work with the kid and teach the kid. So that's where I think probably over the course of time, all of these were good intentions, But now and Mr. Strom said it well, now to unravel this, we would create winners and losers. So we just need to, to have that conversation. I think overwhelmingly talking to educators, not just principals or superintendents, you would hear them say there are significant issues with how schools are currently funded. And we need to address that. And how to do that is the great question.
And Representative Hudson, follow up, otherwise, this is something we'll really dig into probably a week from Thursday. And if folks have their local leaders, this is gonna be a great conversation. So thank you for the primer on that. Representative Bennett, you're on the list. I do have 20 minutes left, so.
Very fast. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Strom, and this has to do with Representative DePel's question, and it can be yes and no, yes or no answer. But the equity line, is that the same as the equalization money that property tax poor and rich districts not? Okay, so you can just say yes or no, you don't have to get into detail.
Mr. Chair, Representative Bennett, no.
Different, okay, thank you.
Okay, and Mr. Strom, if you could. Oh,
Question.
Representative Reimer.
Just a real quick one is thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Strom. I get headaches looking at spreadsheets, and you must embrace this. You explained the local option, and why that is kind of uniform across each school district. It's an opt-in or an opt-out process. I am just curious about the gifted and talented per pupil. What is that money used for? And looking across every district, it's uniform in nature. So I'm just curious how we arrived to that number and what that's used for.
Mr. Strom.
Mr. Chair, the gifted and talented revenue had a legislative sponsor, this is, I think, 35, almost 40 years ago, that decided that unless there was a line item in the general education program for it, gifted and talented education wouldn't be receiving the appropriate amount of attention. The relatively small amount of money that was put in there is, I'm sure, well below what every district spends on their own gifted and talented activities. There is a statute that provides guidance to districts about how their gifted and talented programs, what they should look at, but essentially the state doesn't set the program nature of that. Each district determines their own gifted and talented services and how to provide those. So some districts, some larger districts may do it through a magnet school approach. Some districts may do it with certain kinds of pull-out programs. Every district is different on how they do it, but I think this is one of these examples of where why not just add $13 to the formula allowance and take that out? And again, pardon my bluntness, who wants to be the legislator that says I did away with funding for gifted and talented? So when something like this gets created, it stays and it's there forever. But I think I don't think there's a school district in the state that says that $13 is what allows us as a district to provide gifted and talented education.
Got it.
But at the time, a legislator thought it was really, really important that it have its own component to it. And I apologize for my bluntness today. I'm usually not so. But,
No, Mr. Strom, and that's very welcome. And, it's one of the things I look at every time is why not just roll it in? But as you said, Mr. Strom, what happens down here is protecting ideas sometimes and protecting interests, and that's exactly what it was. So that's what happens sometimes in this budget. Mr. Strom, if we could move on to the general education revenue with the inflation. Let's try to get the inflation one, and then the special ed in that order if we could.
Mr. Chair, members, on the 8.5, 11 size paper oriented landscape style, in the print too small for me to read, but luckily the screen is, the screen is here. Is the general education revenue estimated for fiscal year 26. And this is the first year that the automatic inflation is going to be built into the basic formula allowance. And this is an attempt to show how that inflation is impacting school districts. Because remember that you're measuring from base 2 years ago, the legislature determined that inflation would be added to the base essentially. So an increase over base, essentially school districts are gonna be looking at that base at the inflated level. And so one of the questions before the committee is going to be how do you recognize the effect of inflation over time and what does that look like? And so this printout is oriented the same way as the components of general education, district name and number on the left, the strata at the top, and all amounts are shown up until the last three columns on a per pupil basis. With the pupil count first. You can see that for fiscal year '26, there's about 7,000 fewer pupil units than there were estimated than there were for '25 on the previous printout. And then what the printout shows is that basic formula allowance, which in the previous year was $7,281, is expected to go up due to the inflation in the program calculation to $7,448 per pupil. So every district is essentially going to receive $167 more in fiscal year 2026 from what they would otherwise have received without inflation. And then adding together all the other components of general education revenue, including the three that are linked to inflation that we just talked about, is the next set of columns. And you can see that those columns without inflation, just go to Aiken because it's at the top there, would be receiving $3,176 if there were no inflation. But because of the three categories listed, or the three categories that are linked to inflation, that goes up to $3,217 per pupil. So for the Aiken School District, the inflation benefit to them on the other components outside of the basic formula is $41 per pupil. The average at the top there in the bold number is $27 per pupil. Then the totals are shown, so the overall effect of inflation on the top line there, you can see is $194 to the good. And again, inflation's built into the base, so that's your starting place. But if it had not been in the base, the amount of revenue in general education revenue would have been $194 per pupil less. For the Aiken School District, inflation increased their revenue by $208 per pupil. And you can look up and down the list and seeing the slightly varying amounts that districts get there. And that's because they have different amounts of compensatory, operating sparsity, and transportation sparsity revenue per pupil. So then the next column shows that percent increase that inflation is providing. It's averaging on all the components of general education, including those not linked to inflation. It averages 1.8%, and you can see in that percentage column how each district is benefited by the inflation adjustment. And then the last three numbers are showing that amount in total. So for school districts, adding inflation to general education in fiscal year 2026, which is baseline, added $179 million more to the school district funding than would have been there had there been no inflation that year. So, Mr. Chair, the idea behind this is to allow you to identify the elements of base, including inflation, and see how that inflation portion measures compared to where the school funding would have been without inflation. It's a bit of a new concept for this committee to think about, as inflation previously was not added to the general education formula.
Correct, Mr. Strong. Okay, let's go ahead and move to the special ed, and then we can do a wrap-up question and then shoot for that 240 target.
Mr. Chair, members, the next printout is the special education formula. This is estimated numbers. Special education, as I mentioned, is a cost reimbursement formula. So until the costs are actually final, we won't know what the exact amount of special education funding for the year is. Much harder to estimate the cost-based formulas than the pupil unit-driven formulas. So again, this printout is organized to show the pupil units in that first column. Then the federal funding for special education in Minnesota is primarily through parts B and F. That totals about $193 million in total. federal funding for special ed is less than 10%. It's more like 8%, I think, or 7% this year of total special education funding. So then, taking that 193 million off, presuming that the federal government's paying for its share of special education spending, that leaves an estimated spending by districts on special education services for the 24-25 school year of $3.189 billion. And of that amount, the initial special education aid, or the total special education aid for this year, for fiscal '25, is expected to be just under $2.6 billion, leaving an unfunded cross-subsidy of about $595 million. And then those last four columns show those same columns on a per pupil basis. So the average district's receiving $208 in special ed money per every student, not per special ed student, but per every student. The average school district spending $3,430 per every student. And the average school district is receiving for fiscal year '25, $2,789 per pupil. And the remaining portion, that $641, is the amount of special education funding coming out of the school district's other general fund monies. So a very similar type of printout, organized in district number and order, showing a guesstimate of the special ed funding for fiscal year '25.
Very good. Any quick questions on that? All right, Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick comment about the special ed flexibility with the state buckets. When I was on the ZED board, we would spend the federal dollars, they were more constrained, but the students in special ed are very individuals and didn't fit into the buckets. So I'm hoping the committee keeps an eye at flexibility in that thing. I've got a question on offline, if you can give us, the committee as a whole, a little better background on special ed districts, and then also the arrangements where you're hosting for several schools. They tend to be generally the special ed area, but that would be good. And another offline thing is, has there ever been a look at, instead of sparsity, a look at the average distance per pupil to school, especially in consolidated districts where they have an elementary in this town, a high school in that town? There may be some factors that would better address than the current sparsity. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Quam. Mr. Strong, did you get those questions?
Mr. Chair, yes, and may I ask a question for procedure this year? In past years, when our members ask questions like this at the public hearing, that information I'll provide to the member and to the committee to share at large. Is that the procedure you'd like to follow this year as well?
I would appreciate that. Thank you, Mr.
Okay.
Strong. Okay, Representative Hudson, I'll give you the last question before we wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, I appreciate it. So, just as an example, I'm looking here at Pine Point, and if I'm
Which
reading.
spreadsheet, Mr.?
The spreadsheet we've been
Representative
going
Hudson.
over
Okay,
regarding
special ed.
special ed. And if I'm reading this correctly, they have an unfunded cross-subsidy of $1,591 per pupil. So where's that difference made up? Does it come out of what they're getting in terms of like the base, or do they have any flexibility anywhere else? Are they effectively being denied that amount of money from their base funding category?
And if I could, Mr. Strom, and you can fill in, Representative Hudson, that's why we call it the cross-subsidy. They actually have to pull it out of general education dollars. So they have to make that liability up. Mr. Strom, if you'd like to add to that?
Mr. Chair, yes, Pine Point is one of the state's very smallest school districts. They're located up in Hubbard County. And they are a K-8 school that serves almost entirely American Indian students. So that $1,591 unfunded amount has to come from their other funding. And one of the places, in addition to general education revenue, that they receive some other funding would be through federal impact aid. but probably, probably a diversion of a topic there. But one good reminder is we have a number of very, very small school districts where on a per pupil basis, things can look pretty funny. So I'm always cautious with small school districts because pupil unit may not quite match the spending they've got that last year or something like that. There's a few like Princeburg and Franconia that are non-operating districts that also show some very odd amounts on printouts at times. So I'm always very cautious with the smallest school districts. But as as Chair Creasha said, yes, the reason that's referred to as the cross subsidy is that amount's gonna have to come from the district's other budget. They're providing that service. The service is in their estimated expenditures. That's what the expenditures are based on, is the services provided. And after the formula is applied to them, that's the shortfall that the Pine Point District is estimated to receive. And again, this is estimated expenditures for the current school year that's not yet over. There may be reasons why the district reported last year's number and hasn't had new data to adjust it yet. There may just be all sorts of reasons, and the larger the school district, the less likely we worry about those things. But with a very small school district, even a small variation in the data can cause a big per pupil difference. So very cautious with small districts.
And if I could just add to that, I don't know if you have a follow-up, but members, when we talk about mandates, and one of the things that can happen is when you get in the special ed world, you can add a category, you can add something. Just say, and sometimes it can be, oh, we should just add this to get, because it's the right thing to do. The ripples that creates are enormous. And, a larger school district may have the services, but the way that can be done on the smaller school district, just because of the amount of personnel and so forth, can be a larger per capita expense. So that's why when we start looking at this and all the ripples, those simple conversations of, oh, we should just add this, as once we become the state school board, things get very, very difficult for school districts to manage. So Representative Hudson, did you have a follow-up on that? Great question.
And Mr. Chair, if I could add one more comment.
Yes, please.
On the special ed that I'll lay out in the note to you all, but in terms of Representative Quam's question, the other area where special education funding can look odd is the expenditures might be at the district level where the revenue's going to the co-op that's providing it, or vice versa. So the way that school districts use co-ops for special education services or pair with another district can also throw off a printout reading of what special education situation the district's actually facing.
Very good. Okay, and so members, looking into next week, we're gonna start to look at the MDE budget, as well as later in the week, we'll be inviting you to bring members to the table. We want to hear directly from the schools that are impacted by this. And with that, as I promised, we do have a couple minutes left. I know people have schedules and they're in and out, but is there anybody, this is a public meeting, is there anybody from the outside that would like to introduce themselves briefly? This is, and thank you, Mr. Strom, thank you, Ms. Beckel, and thanks, Ms. Para. You do not have to come up one way or the other, but I just thought, say hi. We're a friendly bunch. Hello, Ms. Grivna. State your name for the record and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Lori Grivna, and I just wanted to say hello and welcome all the new members that are on this committee. We look forward to working with you. I have several clients that are in the education world, including the Association of Metropolitan School Districts, which many of you are aware of, the Anoka-Hennepin District, which was highlighted today in the spreadsheets, the College Board, which does AP and SAT, Serve Minnesota, which does Reading Corps and Math Corps. So we'll be visiting with you on a number of those issues. So just thank you for inviting me to get up and say hello personally to you, and hope you have a great afternoon on the floor.
Thank you. Anyone else? We'll get a couple more minutes. Okay, if not, members, that concludes today's meeting. Remember, you can put documents in your safe packet. Don't fill that too full, just keep it to the pertinent documents that you want. And you can also get the documents on the webpage for reference. Again, thank you, Mr. Strom. Thank you, Ms. Beckel and Ms. Pear. That was, as always, very thorough. And so with that, our next hearing will be Tuesday, January 28th, and we stand adjourned.